In this lab for learning that we've been working on over the last 6 months or so, we're really trying to encourage people to think about learning not just as a sequence of individual events, although those can be kind of important catalysts for learning, but a routine way of working. How is it that we engage with each other as teams or between teams and grantees or across the foundation on a regular basis in our day-to-day work in a way that really increases our capacity to learn, and how well we learn from each other and with each other across silos and move learning beyond kind of an individual capacity. And today we want to dig into one habit in particular, which is this idea of asking powerful questions. I won't go through all of these in detail, but this is just one of 5 core habits that we have identified about that makes learning an everyday thing. And we think the first 2, making thinking visible and asking powerful questions, are really kind of foundational to all of them. We've got content that we would like to share with you is about how we've been thinking about this and experimenting with this capacity of asking powerful questions. And I should say, just to kick us off, I think that the reason that asking powerful questions goes up on this list is because we've heard a few things over the course of our time working with foundation, evaluation, and learning directors about the routines that normally exist around how teams interact. What we noticed is that a lot of folks have trouble focusing their kind of learning lens because there is so much to learn across such a broad array of complex systems that we work in. The task of getting to the real powerful question that helps break open the work faster is a really critical piece to making things sort of move along. And so we really want to zero in on that. We've been thinking about this capacity as really a learning capacity underneath which evaluation lives, right? But it's not just about evaluation questions or about the formal context of evaluation. So as we start talking about this, let's think about it broadly and then zero in at the end when we get into the sort of specific approaches and tools into what the crosswalk with formal evaluation might actually look like. And I want to add one other dimension that kind of worries us about this powerful question feature in foundations, which is that the setting within which powerful questions often get asked, in our experience, are often at moments and times that are really high stakes, where it's a little too late to engage in deep inquiry because what you're trying to do is sell the strategy. So you've done all kinds of work to develop a strategy, you've really grappled with it, you're really invested in it, and then it goes up for review with a larger group or with the board, and you're not actually in a state where you still want it to be open for exploration. That's the other context, that the routine we want to get to here is, how do we start engaging in powerful questions before those high stakes moments when people are still more open to really grappling with some of those tough issues and making adaptations at the right time? With that, let's just jump right in. We kind of have this set up in 3 different parts today. First, I just want to get on the table, like, what do we mean by a powerful question? What comprises a powerful question? How should we think about it, etc. The second piece we want to talk about is powerful questions specifically tied to things like learning agendas and evaluation RFPs and those kinds of formal mechanisms that we use to get questions answered or engage in more systematic answering of questions. And then I want to talk more broadly at the end about just strategies for building the habit of asking powerful questions in informal ways as well, when we are just having staff meetings, strategy meetings, etc., or engaging with grantees. So let's dig in first on this question of what is a powerful question. This is kind of a kludging together of some theory and literature around powerful questions from systems thinking literature and business management literature and strategy stuff and emergent learning and all of the literature on emergence and adaptation and our own kind of reflections and experience. We want to think about a question being powerful when it accomplishes a couple of different things. The idea here, if we think about questions being powerful when they actually spur learning, right? Not necessarily they bring to the table the right bit of information, but really thinking more broadly about that, about questions being powerful when they actually open up people's willingness to engage in inquiry together. They invite the challenging of current operating assumptions. They channel people's attention to what really matters. They're momentum generating. They invite people to be creative and think with a kind of broader set of possibility. Now, if you think about the kinds of questions you tend to see in an evaluation RFP and these criteria, for me, experientially, like as an evaluator, there's a huge gap. I don't think I've ever read an evaluation RFP and thought, oh, I'm super inspired by these questions and I'm energized, and they speak to forward momentum. So I think what that means for us is that we want to actually, for powerful questions, we want to distinguish between questions that are about information conveyance or knowledge acquisition, like what do we have to go gather out in the world to bring to our table to discuss, versus the kinds of questions we pose to each other that open up this kind of inquiry and dialogue. And we can talk about the link between those two in a moment and how they invite a pathway to evaluation and data collection. But let's start with this in this space about inquiry and dialogue questions. That's what we're really looking for with powerful questions. We think that there's this handful of principles to what makes these kinds of questions energizing and inspiring to folks. And, you know, just for folks who haven't been involved in the lab, one of the things we've been dealing with a lot is the act of learning together it's not just a technical act. It's not just about the technicals of finding the right answers and moving forward. It is an act of engagement and inspiration as well. How do you keep people really focused on where they need to go and what they need to grapple with? So we think the kinds of questions that help people get there, these are a little bit obvious, but I think we need to really test our questions and how much they reflect these principles. First of all, they have to meet people where they are and where the most energy is, and that have deep relevance for their work. And we actually find often for folks who are designing learning questions or powerful questions to engage grantees, there can be a real gap between what the foundation assumes is relevant and energizing for a grantee organization or a nonprofit, and what is energizing and relevant for the foundation. So really understanding that nexus of relevance. Secondly, we think powerful questions are actually forward-facing or focused on possibilities for action. Evaluators, we are oriented by our discipline to think retrospectively with our questions, but strategists are about where we're headed, where we're going. So that orienting the question in a forward-facing way and oriented on what you can actually do, we think is a really critical piece. And I just want to cover the two more of these very quickly. There's also something about the genuineness of questions, that we really don't actually know the answer already. We see a lot of evaluation engagements or learning engagements where folks kind of feel like, yeah, we already know how to do this. We already know. Whether that's correct or not is another question. But there's some inauthenticity to the question that's being posed, because we kind of feel like we do know the way forward on this front. And then ultimately, if we actually answered this question, would it make a real difference in the work because you can tie it to your strategic choices? And I actually want to see if Julia, you'd be willing. Julia, we're conducting interviews for the Evaluation Roundtable, and she was speaking to one interviewee the other day who expressed a common frustration with evaluation consultants. I'm wondering if you'd share that.
Yeah, so the person that I was talking to is a head of strategy and learning at a foundation, and her complaint was that consultants have a hard time, or that we're not, or evaluators generally are not setting up strategic choices that relate to decisions. And that was her observation, which I thought had a lot of power in diagnosing what is going wrong between the connection of data and evaluation to actual decisions.
Like, how are we really zeroing our questions in on the way forward and the set of choices you have in front of you, as opposed to, or in addition to, those big, broad, sweeping, descriptive questions about that are also important to understand. What's the state of the field? What are the dynamics at play? All of those things are important to understand to get you to find your way forward. But that kind of core powerful question is really about what is the strategic choice in front of us that we need to understand and move forward through. So those are kind of broad, that's a broad screen to think about the quality of questions that you have. But I think there's some really interesting stuff around, let's just talk the architecture of powerful questions that help get at those principles. And so this is from a long-standing piece that's called The Art of Powerful Questions that was written in like the late 90s that I think is an outstanding piece from some systems thinking folks. And so we just want to talk about this, the architecture of your questions. So while I'm doing this, think through if, for example, you have recently held a convening with grantees that's oriented around a learning question, and think through the architecture of that question. Or if you have learning questions in a learning agenda now, kind of have that in the back of your mind while we go through this. So there's essentially three core pieces to the architecture of a powerful question: construction, scope, and assumptions. So let's talk first about this element of construction. So I want you to think here about how questions begin. So staff tend to operate in a yes-no zone, and many evaluation questions that get answered are about which and to what extent. Sometimes they're also hopefully about why, right? But there's a lot of sort of descriptive work in that. But these higher level interrogatives, so questions like how, why, and what, and I'll say a little more about what later, are more likely to spur creativity and exploration and open up this space. And as importantly, they also activate the other learning habits, right? So if you are asking people, if the questions you are posing are things like, how can we X? Or how does it happen that Y occurs? That conversation automatically forces people to do a couple of key things that are critical for really powerful learning. One is they have to articulate their thinking. They have to say, I think that if we do this, this happens, and here's why. Which means that they're also attending to causal inference, like really paying attention to what leads to what and what's your model of change. And it kind of automatically leads you into the now what zone, which is the last of the kind of critical habits. So this construction issue is about how often and how well do you focus on the top end of that pyramid. And just as a couple of examples here, these are examples of that hierarchy. So the top level questions are mirror some of those principles that we saw in the first slide by actually using those higher level interrogatives. So how can we activate and prepare youth coming out of the juvenile justice system to become leaders in the reform movement? That is energizing. You have to say out loud what your thinking is. You have to say out loud how you think the causal inferences or causal links work. And it has a naturally embedded now what. You'll see as you go down that chain, you get to the bottom of that, those number 4 and 5 again tend to be the kinds of things, 3, 4, and 5, the kinds of things that evaluations are structured to answer, which is important, but maybe not the question that kind of energizes the folks in the room. Okay, so thinking about construction, using higher level interrogatives, that's the kind of critical piece we want to take away here because of the kind of conversation it engages in the staff. The second piece of the architecture is about scope. And this relates to something that several of you brought up. Myron, you talked about the kinds of questions focusing on alignment with strategy. So the idea here is you really want to tailor the questions, the question scope within people's capacity to take effective action, right? So if it's too big, then people can kind of get swallowed in vague conclusions. It's a big vague question, you come up with big vague conclusions, and nobody leaves knowing, oh wait, now I have an idea about how to move forward or a clear insight about what it's going to take to do this. If it's too small, it's uninspiring and why bother type of question. So we really want to grapple with this thing about scope. And this is the thing, when I facilitate learning events, I find that this is the piece I struggle with the most, is getting the scope right to the people in the room so that it keeps them really activated around what's possible in their own arena of action. So let's just have some examples. Too big. How could we shift the juvenile justice system to a restorative justice paradigm so that children remain in community with dignity and passion? That is a fantastic question. And it is a 5-year-long discussion. That is the exploration of systems, which is all super critical and really important part of the piece. But when you're in the space of engagement with each other, it's really hard for people to know how to enter that question in a way that makes their thinking visible on a level they can engage with each other. You know, I think it's this, I think it's that. Probably it's all of these things because there's so many factors at play. A more right-sized question might be something within the foundation's scope of action or grantee scope of action. might be something like, well, how might we create incentives for the JJ systems administrators to champion a restorative justice approach? It's a scope we can actually engage in. Again, it's not to say that this other question isn't actually a great aspirational question, but when it comes to really being able to dive in and examine thinking, that kind of what's on our plate in the near future, in the next year and a half, that we really could pull off is the right kind of zone for engagement. Another one, I was actually in a conversation where somebody posed this question the other day, which was, how can we address rural poverty? Which was great, but you can have a doctoral degree in how to address rural poverty and what the factors at play are, et cetera. Again, maybe a great aspirational question. But for this particular foundation, they were new engaging in place-based work in rural areas. And so what they actually had to grapple with within the next year was, how do we improve our ability to show up and build trust and credibility in these communities we're entering for the first time? That was in fact their most pressing action, that the nut they had to crack in the next year to move forward on this bigger question and vision that they were working on. One more example. How do we change relationships between farmers and environmentalists who are working on water rights? Now, I want to just talk a little bit about this one, because this could actually be a really great strategy question that people need to grapple with. The right-sized example I've put here is, how could we use this first convening to establish deep interpersonal trust between participants representing presumably conflicting interests? So this is about scaling to the opportunity on the table. The one on the left might be a great question for designing a larger scale strategy. But if the opportunity on the table is just this one convening that you really need to get right, the right kind of learning question or powerful question here that opens up people's thinking on how you go about this, is actually scaled to the opportunity at hand, right? So I use this one just to illustrate that sometimes multiple questions at multiple levels or scopes can be at play in the organization. But if you really need the work on the table is what you kind of need to anchor your question asking in. So that's the second piece, scope.
Tanya, can I ask a question here?
Sure, of course.
So I'm looking at the second row around how can we address rural poverty, and then the question about building trust, credibility in rural communities. And so I'm thinking you're talking about capacity and scope, and timing also matters. So I'm wondering if you could take that first question for a program area that's moving into addressing rural poverty, and this is a new area of work for them, so they don't really know what to do. How do they get to that second question without first having exploration of that broader question of the types of things that they might be doing around rural poverty? So how do you appropriately sequence these things?
I think that's a fantastic question that I struggle with a ton, right? Is how these go. So, or how these fold out. So the big question of how can we address rural poverty, even by itself, could maybe use a little bit more specificity. Like, just as an example, what happens if you reframe that question to say, what is our foundation uniquely positioned to do to change the conditions of rural poverty in our state? Even just by changing the frame like that, what you've done is sort of put a scope around what's the universe of anything that anybody might do that might be required to address rural poverty, which is a study question, right? There's a whole bunch of literature on that, all kinds of thinking on that, to really zeroing in on what is the thing that is about us being able to take action in this space. So without getting sort of overwhelmed by the numbers of questions on the table, we tend to think about nested questions. You know, you have great big questions that might be the ones that kind of guide your thinking on 5-year strategy. And then you might have some real meaty learning questions that are just about, like, this is our next best thing. We know we're not going to be able to make progress on the 5-year game unless we can get credibility in these communities that we're trying to enter into. I'm sensitive to the fact that there's a lot to hold in your heads too, right? About the size and scale of questions, and there's so many questions often on the table. I do feel like that there is a sequencing about which is the right question at the right time. This is hard to do in the abstract when you're not thinking about your specific work on the table, but I'm hoping we can get to that here in a minute. All right, I'm going to do one more piece of the architecture, and then we'll get to pause. The third piece of architecture of a question is actually about the embedded assumptions that live in your question. the idea here, or the principle here on the architecture, is that you're actually examining questions for implicit assumptions that are going to be introduced into the conversation, actually constrain what you can talk about. So the advice here is to test different frames when you're developing trying to develop a powerful question, to see if it opens up new possibilities or invites a totally different kind of inquiry. So let me give you just a couple of examples. Imagine, back to the same question, we're grappling with what does it actually take to convince juvenile justice systems administrators that a restorative approach would actually be in their best interest? That's a slightly different question than how can we minimize juvenile justice systems administrators' resistance to a restorative approach, which is also a little different from what kinds of models or paradigms are juvenile justice systems administrators most likely to be inspired to get behind. And why? A whole other zone of inquiry. How can we identify and build champions for a restorative justice approach in order to influence policymakers? When I develop learning questions with a group, part of what we try to do is test different frames to see what is exactly the conversation we actually want to have. In one set of these questions, the assumption is that we got to get juvenile justice administrators into the game with us. There's another set of assumptions on the other side that are, maybe they're not the ones to even engage. And the question we should actually be asking is there a different route of influence that we should take to move forward on this issue?
Can I interrupt 1 second? You just talked about learning questions, and we are talking about powerful questions. So can you just take a moment to distinguish between those two?
Oh, yes. We are thinking about the art of powerful questions as a key sort of learning tool or a learning habit, because of the kind of conversation and inquiry it opens up. So in my head, I tend to interchange them. It's going to be a learning question if it actually helps open up a different kind of inquiry and invites people to be interested in different kinds of data and input. But I think it might be up for debate if those are two different things. And I'll actually talk about that a little when we get to the learning agendas piece. For me, the key piece here is, do you have the skill of asking the kinds of questions that get people to engage in a different and new way, rather than just focusing on the kinds of questions that are going to get the right information to the table. I have to say, this is a hypothesis on our part about what it actually takes to create questions, to pose questions that keep people engaged in learning, right? So I think about powerful questions as those that really inspire and invite people into inquiry, which is maybe distinct from questions that pinpoint the information that has to be brought to the table. Now, I do think that the kinds of powerful questions you ask can be a guide for the kinds of information you bring to the table, which we'll talk about with the learning agenda and data piece here in a second. But I think one of the things we're getting tripped up on is as a field is the difference between questions that engage and inspire and questions that are about what we need to educate ourselves about. That's the distinction that we're trying to make. And I don't know, I think it's controversial. We debate about it ourselves, right? About whether that's the right sort of orientation. Mm-hmm. I'd like to give a couple of examples, and then I want to actually switch. I want to pause for a second and just think about what kinds of questions you're focusing on that seem to energize people. And then I want to switch into this other question of, so what's the link between these questions that energize and inspire people to engage and the kinds of information gathering questions or study questions that we tend to think about with data and evaluation. So just very quickly, I'm going to do these. So that's the overall point about the architecture. I compiled a couple of failures of my own on engaging people in learning questions to illustrate some failed questions. So one, for example, is how can we cover everyone? Well, based on our principles, what's wrong with this question? So big abstract questions tend to lead to big abstract conversations, which may be critical stage setting questions, but they don't necessarily get people down to that point of strategic choice making. Where do we intervene? Why do we think that's the right path, etc. They tend to invite actually people talking about only exclusively sort of big systems levers, which are, again, also critical, but not necessarily going to open up that strategic choice making point. If your questions are actually focused on the realm of action that you actually have, in this particular case, the more appropriate question that this group ended up coming up with was, how can we enroll the hardest to reach communities where we don't have any existing relationships or partners? That is the thing they had to grapple with. They had to go test on the ground. They had to observe with evaluation to see how it worked, etc. because it was their zone of action. Second one that we actually ran into was, why do so many of our program participants drop out? Great question, important to understand and know. But what I observed about the way the room engaged around this question was that they were totally depressed, and it didn't lead to a generative discussion about, so what? Now what? What do we do instead? It's a useful question, but maybe isn't quite energizing. So by recasting the question, what would it take for us to keep program participants in all the way to program completion? It energized the conversation in a whole new way. Now, importantly, the data from the evaluation work from that top question, we brought to the table. We could actually say, well, we know that this is why they're dropping out. These people are, these people aren't, et cetera. But the question reframing for a forward-looking focus actually helped them move into the now what question rather than kind of wallow in the retrospective space. Third one, how do we build stakeholder alignment? This is a disaster of a question. And what actually happened with me on this one is that we talked for like 4 hours only to discover at the end that everybody's thinking about different stakeholders and they were thinking about alignment differently. So those kinds of fuzzy language actually masks pretty substantial differences in what people are actually talking about and trying to learn about together. So trying to be crystal clear with the language, what we discovered after uncovering it, what we were actually asking is, how do we get advocates and agencies to agree on this common goal for system? That's what we meant by alignment, was common goals for a systems effort, right? That's the stage we were in. That's what we needed to grapple with. Last one, and then I'll be quiet and let's discuss as a group a little bit, was what will it take to create a good policy brief? So blah, who cares? That's a lame question. But also, the assumption that the brief is the right approach is a little bit too narrow for a learning conversation, right? Because what we actually want to know, the whole point of doing a policy brief was to actually engage influential advocates and policymakers such that they would support our solution. So maybe the brief's not the right path, right? What's our actual strategy here? What is it that we really need to grapple with? So this is an example of an overly narrow question with a set of assumptions behind it that close down our thinking. So I want to pause, because that was a lot of stuff all at once, and just say, I recognize that forward-facing questions about action are very different from study questions or knowledge acquisition questions. Just to reiterate one more time, it's our experience that the forward-facing, action-oriented frame is the psychological piece that helps people stay engaged and inquire in a different way.
So, because like my understanding was that vis-a-vis learning is that we put an inquiry about like to learn, okay, what were we expecting initially, and then what actually happened, and then based on the quote unquote what actually happened and the kind of the learnings from that we use it to then inform our next steps or next decisions.
Yep.
So I guess I'm just having a little difficulty distinguishing the retrospective questions, because I was always under the assumption that we ask retrospective in order to inform the prospective, right, the future actions.
Yep.
So can you just maybe talk more about that?
Sure. Okay, let me just skip to this, because this actually illustrates conceptually for me. Let's just set up a really concrete situation that you might encounter in a foundation that is one step below a formal learning agenda. And then we'll talk about how I see the link between these two. So let's imagine you've got staff in a room coming up with ideas about how to engage folks let's use the rural engagement example from an earlier question. We're entering into communities for the first time because we've got this long-term rural poverty initiative. We've never worked in rural communities. We've observed that we've got a lot of issues with credibility in rural spaces because we're urban based. So the dilemma on the table that we have to solve is, what would it take for us to build the right kind of credibility in those communities so that we can do other stuff? The way that question opens a conversation is to say, on the one hand, it's to say, well, what do we know? What is it going to take for us to do that? It's the thing we have to accomplish. It's the most relevant to our work going forward. It's the thing we're puzzling over with now. It's what it takes to be good at our job. all the stuff we know about adult learning, right? It's got to be relevant and energizing and stuff like that. So what that question actually invites in that space is for people to look back and ask the retrospective questions and say, well, what do we already know about this? What do we already know from the past about what it takes to do this? It doesn't close down the possibility for actually doing the retrospective work, but it is the question, the forward-facing questions that people care about. So I see my job as the learning facilitator or the evaluator to say, as you grapple with your most pivotal forward-facing question, here's the retrospective stuff I can bring to the table to help you think about it. What do we know from the past? Now, at the same time, what it's also doing is when they grapple with a question like that to decide the way forward, they're going to come up with a bunch of hypotheses about what it actually takes to do that. They'll say, well, all right, based on this past data and everything that we've seen and what didn't work before, we think if we do this, this is going to happen. Now, my job as an evaluator or thinking about data collection is to say, all right, so what would we have to observe to know if those hunches are right? And it actually gives me a signal for where to focus my evaluation work so that I can loop it back into their learning question, which is about their forward-facing question, not my retrospective question. So in this model, it's a pretty big mindset shift. But in this model, the retrospective work and the observational work of evaluation are inputs into what their real learning question is, which is the thing they have to grapple with to get the results they want. It's a different kind of orientation or relationship to how strategists think versus how evaluators think. Retrospective look, prospective look, how do those things link together? So let me just pause there and just does that make sense? What's your reaction to that? How do you feel about it?
I think this is just wonderful. And this is really just almost a nomenclature thing that people who do developmental evaluation and formative evaluation and front-end evaluation would think that they are doing the prospective stuff. I would just want to note that there are those traditions that really do align with your strategic approach side of this beautiful document.
There's a piece to this. It was actually through the developmental evaluation work that we were doing with the Hewlett Foundation that we really started to struggle with. Like, you get the data back and you put stuff on the table. You say, so what happened? And you get the data and you say, what does this reveal about our hypotheses, et cetera? And people say, that is interesting. And if you're lucky, you can say, so then how should we apply this going forward? But in that scenario, you've actually lost the heart of the question. What is the thing we were trying to figure out how to do? By keeping the question forward facing, we can say, so we're grappling with how it is that you get entree and credibility into these rural communities. We've tried some stuff. We observed what worked. Here's what the data say. Now what can you conclude about how you can get credibility in these communities? Which invites them to stay in the strategy mode, pull the data, the retrospective data into the strategy conversation and look forward. So it's really supposed to function like an invitation into a different kind of conversation.
That's a really great and important distinction. Thank you so much for making it.
Thanks, Vera. Julia?
Yeah, I just want to add that I think in trying out this framing and orientation to, in particular, learning questions and learning agendas, we've really experienced a palpable energy shift in the room when people really understand the difference and the relationship between an evaluation or study question and a learning question that is really about their own work and really connects evaluation to decision making and action, and it's just a huge energy shift. I was dubious, but I've experienced it on several occasions now. So I just wanted to add that.
Would you guys like to see an example of a learning agenda laid out with this as the primary organizing principle? That help maybe. So this is a little clunky because it's supposed to look like kind of mirror the familiarity of an evaluation framework. But it flips the organizing principle from evaluation questions or outcomes as the organizing principle to the learning questions as the organizing principle. So here's how it's basically set up. So on the left, it's what's the learning question? What's the thing we really need to figure out this year or in the next 2 years that without which we can't have success in this initiative? So that is the question that matters to the strategists or the grantees in this case. So in this example, the first question, this is actually a program delivery group that was trying to expand. They was dealing with hunger, trying to expand food bank sites, do pop-up sites to be present in sort of new places, et cetera, while they also had a policy agenda. So this learning, very practically, this group was grappling with what's it going to take to expand traffic to the food bank sites in Glenwood, Aurora, and Thornton, which are all cities in Denver. So it's a pretty straightforward question, but it's the thing they needed to figure out, like what's possible here? How do we expand? And they had some operating hypotheses. So they didn't have staff themselves to like expand physical locations, but what they were going to test was partnering with particular kinds of folks who have outreach to families to get attraction to their main sites, and then do pop-up food delivery and co-hosting at neighborhood sites in these new neighborhoods. It's a pretty straightforward strategy, pretty clear set of hypotheses. What they care about is how do we expand our traffic? My job as the evaluator was to say, okay, so they've made a bet on how to do that. What are we going to observe and understand with data as they put this stuff to the test to bring back to the table to answer this question? So these look like more conventional, in that third column, more conventional evaluation questions. How many and what kinds of outreach partnerships were we able to develop? What kinds of people do the partners connect with? These are a lot more sort of descriptive pieces, because in this case, they were actually having to collect their own data. How many have more people in the targeted neighborhoods heard of us? Kind of conventional retrospective stuff. The point is, as they put this stuff into action, it makes their work into a testing ground. They start to understand that what we're putting out there into the world is a testing ground for actually learning how to make this happen. Their job, the evaluator's job, was to track and evaluate, actually gather data on this stuff, test some causal connections, et cetera. But when they came back together to reflect on this, the question on the table is not what outcomes did we see? The question on the table is still, what does it take to expand traffic to our sites? My job, or the evaluator's job, is to say, well, this is what we know from the data. We can reflect on this from the past. Now, what are our new hypotheses about how to do this? So it closes the full learning loop and keeps a link between the evaluative stuff and the real question that they're grappling with. So that's one example. So there's a handful here that illustrate what happens when you flip a traditional evaluation framework to lead with learning questions. And again, our kind of core hypothesis here is that learning questions belong to the learners. They are not for evaluators to answer. What evaluators do is bring the data and the insights to the table for the learners to make sense of. That is the most critical distinction here, right? Is as soon as you created a question that gets handed off to the evaluator, it's done. The energy is done, the interest is done. The evaluator still owns the work of trying to find the data that will help illuminate the question, but that's the kind of ownership piece that we think falls apart with learning agendas and keeping people energized around them.
Tanya, I want to put out there a really practical question. There's such a fine distinction you're making here. I mean, everyone in the group here are people who are used to developing questions and leading and facilitating those processes. Mm-hmm. And also many people here are commissioning evaluation from evaluators, not actually doing them themselves. And one of the things that evaluators are told to do is to come up with strategic learning and to not say the obvious, but to actually, synthesize and create sense, make sense making, and say something that is, different than just describing what you're seeing. So your earlier statement that it's not the evaluator's job to answer the learning questions, but to provide the data, just wondering how that jives with this notion of strategic evaluation and synthesis and sense making.
So that's both a sort of professional discomfort for evaluators. What's the zone of where we help with strategy versus the fine line between our roles, all that kind of stuff. And it is also a nature of the question problem, right? So the way I think about it is as an evaluator. So let's say, for example, this is my dream world, is that a foundation would say, these are the questions we are grappling with. We need to figure out how to do X. We're testing some stuff this year, et cetera. Like, this is what we're grappling with. What is the evaluative work you could do that would help us grapple with those questions? So my job would be to think about, all right, how do I set this up to observe the right kinds of, to really understand what outcomes they're seeing from their hypotheses? What is the variation and patterns that we're detecting across that? What's the kind of causal links that we can establish with what kind of certainty? Knowing then that my job is again, to say, okay, so here's what we know from the past about these things that you've tested with respect to this question. Now, how do you take all of that? What's the sense-making process we go through to say, given what we've observed from what happens in the past, what works, did it play out like you thought it would, did it not? Now, what's the forward-facing conclusion about the, how do we do this? And it just, I feel like it would shift the orientation. I think most evaluators are responding to questions in RFPs about learning by just recasting evaluation questions with the language of learning around it. And it's the same. It's the same that they would have done had it just been any other kind of evaluation. So there's something we got to improve about the field and what it is we are asking for when we are asking for a learning question versus an evaluation question.
There's a big implication here because we're talking about habits, and you're actually adding to the list of habits of what are the kinds of things that get commissioned from evaluators? What kinds of questions are people asking evaluators to respond to is another habit, and that everyone has a role in helping programs shape the right kinds of questions.
Yes, yep. And I do think also the other way that plays out, Jane, is, but I wonder if evaluators sometimes read the word learning question and their role in learning as answering and presenting, and then as opposed to the sense-making process. How are you going to participate as an evaluator in the sense-making process so that people can figure out what to do next? I have just a couple more practical slides that I want to share with you very quickly. We've also experimented a little bit with some pretty simple tools in the kinds of settings where you just need people to kind of up their game on questions. These tools work in part just because they can trigger quality questions, but also because forcing people into a structure can help you bypass some of the organizational dynamics, kind of like the devil's advocacy role. If you assign someone devil's advocate, then it's okay to play it. I have a few slides here at the end that suggest structures or ways you can actually invite people to ask different kinds of questions when you do a strategy discussion or prep for a convening or something like that. We frequently give people the beginning of a question that they have to then complete as a way to shift the nature of the question they ask. As you read this strategy kind of idea or engage with this strategy idea that your colleague has, and you have to ask a question that starts with, well, what will it take to X with respect to this strategy? They come up with way deeper stuff than the open question of what questions do you have about this strategy? So on this slide, there's a few different pieces around the kinds of questions you can use to help people surface their assumptions. What would have to be true for this to work? Or what would cause X piece of your thinking to go awry? Or under what conditions will this happen versus that happen? It's all stuff we all know, but I've found it's super useful to have that structure in the meeting space to just invite staff into a deeper kind of question. We took some of the habits around thinking like combating biases and tried to structure some questions around those to help staff pose them or ask them in space. There's another set of kind of cheat sheet questions that I've seen people have cheat sheets at their table when they're about to engage in a conversation, just to trigger their thinking. They can pick different levels of questions over as you go through a process. So starting with descriptive questions to understand the process, the question, the nature of the problem, etc., but moving into these deeper level strategic questions. If people have a structure to follow, they start to internalize the type of question that opens up a new level of engagement, helps people make their thinking visible, helps people combat biases in the space. I think I want to just close with a quick observation and a little bit links to point about not knowing necessarily what's the right data to bring to answer the question. And it goes back to understanding like the distinction between the purpose of evaluation is the reduction of uncertainty. It's different from research which is intended to establish with some degree of certainty, the proof levels on causal connections, etc. So there's no situation in which evaluation or data, when you're working in complex stuff, can answer the way forward entirely. So there's something about shifting, and also because we work in complex settings, we're always working in situations of imperfect information. When we try to capture the universe of what we don't know in questions or in data, it's not only soul crushing and disheartening, it is also a misrepresentation of what it means to work in complex situations, where the best we can know and do is sort of like this reduction of uncertainty about the dynamics we're operating in and what our next steps could produce and will produce, and what's our know-how for getting results in that context. So there's something about focusing your learning questions in a way that helps people see their way forward with just the next thing they got to tackle, that I think can be really empowering and powerful for staff that are working in really hard settings. And maybe shifting the idea about the data you bring to the table, and you're working in a particular kind of environment around this with a lot of researchers on staff, to say the role here with the data is how do we reduce uncertainty about the way forward in our learning conversation. That might free people up a little bit from the anxieties that come with those laundry lists of learning questions. You guys, that was like a ton of content, and you're very patient to have sat with it all. I hope that it was useful, at least in sparking some different thinking, and that you'll give us feedback or push on what we've been grappling with here. Thank you guys so much for joining in.